And we're back. And if you're joining us now, we are getting our second conversation for this morning started. And we are joined now by the Executive Director of the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, Dr. Colin Young. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning to both of you, and good morning to the viewing public.
Yes, so shifting gears to talk about climate change now, this is a really interesting, well, the whole topic of climate change is interesting, but perhaps for the benefit of some of our viewers, you could give us a little bit of background about what the center is and what it does.
Okay. Thank you very much. The Caribbean Community Climate Change Center is headquartered in Belize, and it has been here since 2005. It is a CARICOM institution as a result by mandate of all of the CARICOM heads of government. It is the only institution in the region that is mandated specifically to coordinate the Caribbean's response to climate change. And so we work with all of the 15 CARICOM member states, and we work primarily to provide data, climate-related data, that we then provide to policymakers so they can make evidence-based decisions about how they plan to do development activities and initiatives. The other area that we work with member states is by trying to work with them to access financing, climate change financing, to build climate resilience, climate adaptation, as well as to transition certain sectors like energy from fossil fuels to renewable energy, or from transport into more greener energy. And the third area that we work with is in coordinating amongst the political directorate CARICOM's position going into international climate change negotiations, so that we go there with a united front and a united voice to highlight and amplify those areas that are important to us in the Caribbean.
Yeah.
So that's what we do at the Climate Change Center.
Yeah. Now, it is absolutely, it's an interesting time because the entire world is preparing for the COP conference coming up at the end of October into November. And I just wanted to ask you, it seems that there is a shift globally where all the climate change deniers their voices are quieter as we see so many different impacts across the globe for climate change. I think I read somewhere where it said we can stop saying climate change, we can say climate changed, because we're seeing the impact. Tell me how this sets the backdrop for Belize and the Caribbean going into COP.
That's a very good point, Marlene. And unfortunately, while there has been, for example, the publication of this landmark 6th assessment report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that really sort of provide the kind of backative that we've always been saying, that look, climate change is happening. It's happening all over the world. Global temperatures are rising faster than we thought. We have about 20 years to pursue actions today to stop us from arriving at sort of critical threshold. But yet, even with all of that, and even with the floods we're seeing in Germany, the wildfires in Greece, the strong hurricanes we're seeing in this part of the region and elsewhere, global action has been less than desirable. People would remember that in 2015, in the historic Paris Agreement, I was in the room in Paris at the time when 191 countries committed to a whole set of actions that we'll undertake to keep global temperatures below 1.5. And here we are in 2020. The IPCC report telling us that we'll get there in 20 years. We see the G20, we see the G7 meeting and talking and not enough action. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change just a few weeks ago published what they call a synthesis report. This report looks at all of the actions called the nationally determined contributions that countries submit to say that I will do A, B, and C to help reduce global temperatures. When they added up all of that and look at how much carbon emissions will be cut, it still gets us way above the 1.5 degree. So I guess what I'm saying is that there's still a lot of talk and not enough action. And even though our countries in the region are small, the Caribbean contributes less than 1% of the global emissions of greenhouse gases that cause global warming, but we are at the forefront of the war on the impacts
Most
of climate
impacted,
change. So
yeah.
we are being pummeled, we are being impacted, our people are being severely impacted by the effects of climate change, but yet we are undertaking actions to cut our emissions, in some cases proportionally greater than some of the larger countries. And so at COP26, when we expect over 30,000 delegates to show up, we are hopeful that the small countries in SIDS, the small island developing states, can continue the diplomatic pressure to put on the largest of emitters, including those in the G20, to do their fair share to ensure that global temperatures are kept below 1.5.
I imagine after hearing what you just said, you were one of the many people across the Caribbean clapping when you heard Prime Minister Motley say at the UN that the needle has not moved.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let me just bring it back for a moment, though, because I think it's one of the things that in talking about climate change, we can be very technical. It is technical when you talk about emissions and whatnot. But when we allow people to understand one of the key points that you said there, which is we are not the main contributors, but we are the ones who feel it the most. And in Belize, for example, although I know you represent the Caribbean, we know things like erosions. We know changing temperatures and even predictability for agriculture and marine resources, coral bleaching, sargassum. So there's so many different things that we hear about that we are challenged with that can be attributed back to this issue. How do you keep that message as something that all Caribbean citizens can be able to understand, especially when we head into these negotiations?
I think you rightly framed it, Marlene, because while the conversation for climate change and global warming has largely been an academic one, in truth, our people all over the region have been experiencing the effects of climate change. So they know it firsthand. They may not call it climate change or that, that the CO2 emissions have increased by X. No, but the farmer who is seeing more frequent droughts and their crops are not growing and they're losing money and they are one drought away from going into bankruptcy, those people know that the rains don't come as they were expected to. Because in Belize, for example, we know that the rainy season starts in June. And so farmers have aligned the planting of their crops for when the rains are expected to come. But because one of the effects of climate change is increased droughts or changing the timing at which the rain comes, a month or two off can have a disastrous impact on that farmer. The same thing with human health. When we look at what increased temperatures does to heat waves that have a disastrous impact on construction workers and anybody who has to work outside in the farm, heat stress is a much bigger issue. When we see the resort owners and the people who live in coastal towns, where they have to be spending all this money to try to keep the sea from out of their house or from getting rid of their beaches. These are all impacts of climate change. When the tour guides are taking tourists to the reef and they're seeing the coral bleaching and they're seeing less fish and the fishermen and fisherwomen are catching less fish, all of these things are associated with climate change. So for the people, trying to link that experience to now with climate change, I think is relatively easy. We need to do a better job at it by making it practical. But they know because they're feeling the effects of it. What has been missing is that we have been clamoring for over a decade, saying to the international community, these things are happening. And it's not a hoax. Climate change is not a hoax. We're feeling it. You promised that you would do a number of things to help. One of them is to cut back your activities that pollutes the environment in terms of greenhouse gases. Another one is that you would provide money, $100 billion per year to countries who need it.
Like us.
And up to now, this has been done since 2009, the international community has not delivered that promise. And the third is that they would also provide technology and technology transfer that would allow our countries to adapt. So this is a climate justice issue. We don't cause the problem. We are suffering the effects of the problem, and then you're dilly-dallying. Those of you who are causing the problem, you're dilly-dallying, you're putting all kinds of bureaucracy in place, you're talking and not doing what you need to do to keep the world's temperature below this critical threshold.
Yeah.
Is there, earlier you had, you used the term, to apply sort of the diplomatic pressure to get them to do that. Is there sort of a strategy or coordinated strategy among I suppose within, the 5 Cs, but also among all of these member states, states, who are sort of experiencing the brunt of the issues, in the way that you described?
Yeah, so what we normally do is that the center helps to coordinate along with and you rightly said the member states, because the CARICOM member states. And so, for example, on October 15th, we have the last pre-COP, what we call the pre-preparatory meeting with ministers and senior policymakers, at which point we hope to issue a declaration that is CARICOM's, a CARICOM declaration on what we expect to get from the COP and what is it that the political leaders are demanding of the world leaders in this space. So we do that leading up to the COP. We also participate in helping to support youth voices. There's recently a youth parliament in which we supported. There's the Caribbean Youth Network that we support, as well as other vulnerable groups, women, youth, and indigenous peoples, because the more voices that we have joining this conversation, the better it is.
Yeah.
And so that's how we do it. At the end of the day, we are small. We are not mighty in terms of any kind of wielding any kind of economic power.
Yeah.
But when we are united as a large set of countries, we can exert political pressure or diplomatic pressure on the largest of the countries. So that is what we hope to do. And now the science is absolutely clear. So they can no longer say, oh, but we're uncertain about A, B, and C. Now we have the kind of scientific underpinnings to justify why it is that we are demanding as small island states that we have to keep global temperatures below 1.5, because after that, the impacts on our countries would be so devastating, it's hard to get people to understand.
Yeah.
But I'll give you one. The estimates are saying that if we get to 1.5 degrees Celsius above from what we were in 1850, that you will have a 70 to 90% reduction in coral reefs. 70 to 90% reduction. Now think of what that would mean for the tourism industry in a country like Belize and any other country that has reefs. Think of what that would mean for the fisher folks who depend on the reef, right? So I talk about food security, and just that one thing. So then when you look at what is expected to happen for hurricanes, the category 4 and 5s, the Caribbean State of the Climate Report is saying that under some of these scenarios, you can expect up to an 80% increase in these types of
and we've been
monstrous
seeing it.
storms.
Yeah.
Now, luckily Belize has been spared. Some of our Caribbean nations have not been so lucky to be spared the category 5s. But we saw what it did to Dominica. 225% of its GDP gone in a few hours by a category 5 hurricane. You know what that does to the sustainable development aspirations of a people? You know what it does to the poverty and all of the other essential services that the government has to provide for its people? Now, you would expect that the international community who is causing this problem would be the first to jump in line to provide the financing to help you rebuild, because we didn't cause it. And that is one of the fights we've been having. You know, to one, deliver what you promise, because you're not doing that. And two, don't pretend that you're not responsible for this and then try to find all kinds of ways to delay getting that money to us.
Well, what has changed? And I appreciate what you're talking about with impact of changing temperatures on coral reefs, but we also here in Belize City, the rising sea levels, that's a major concern for us. But as you talk about powerful storms, Dr. Young, one of the things, and I don't say it casually because people have lost property and lives, but these larger countries, these quote unquote more powerful countries are now feeling the impact as well. With these major storms, with flooding that they've never seen in years, wildfires that they couldn't fathom, they are now seeing these types of things taking place. Do you think that will have an impact in the decision-making process this time around?
I am absolutely hopeful that it will have an impact, because for the first time, some of the countries are seeing what we have been experiencing for so long. And even though as bad as it is in those countries over the last year or two, without sounding insensitive, that is a small portion of what we have been experiencing in this part of the world. The difference, of course, is they have the money, they have the technology, they have the means to be able to bounce back. Those of us in the Caribbean, we don't. Let me perhaps share a staggering number with the Belizean public. Belize is ranked as one of those countries that are very, very vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And each year, about 7% of our GDP is lost in equivalent from damages related to climate change. 7% of our losses equivalent to GDP. That means now that, and if you think of what our GDP grows, even before COVID, you know, you're talking about 1%, 2%, but then you're losing the equivalent of about 7%. So when the farmers have a $30 million drought up north, when there's big floods that wash away a bridge, and that the government has to rebuild, or wash away a road, or cause this kind of massive erosion where critical infrastructure, and you have to spend that money. When you add all of that up, from the rains, from the floods, from the droughts, from storms, that comes up to about 7% of GDP per year, right? That is on an average year. That's not with a category 5 or a 4 or 3 hurricane. So you're absolutely right. I'm hoping, against all odds, that with the science being very clear, with the larger countries suffering and seeing, and their people suffering directly now the impacts of climate change, that would spur the political will. Because at the end of the day, this is a political decision for the leaders to do what it takes to change the course of history as it relates to the temperature increase.
And the agreement has already been made for climate financing. And that's a critical push, because when you talk about what it costs us, the 100 billion that should be allotted for those who are most vulnerable for mitigation and prevention, what is the I mean, how much would this be able to help? And also, how do you distribute it equitably, if we can get there, this is optimistic, to ensure that countries like Belize, who faced a lot of impact and who will probably face more impact, can get their fair share?
The access to, so one, Marlene, when they say that we have 100 billion, then it's not automatic, right? And so one of the issues that countries have been saying for at least a decade is that, look, you have to provide this money because that's your obligation, but then don't make it so difficult that it's almost impossible to get. And so access is a key issue. And so in that is one of the areas that the 5 Cs works with member states because we have at the center the capacity to both access and to manage these projects. We have since 2005 mobilized over 260 million US dollars on behalf of member states to do the work. At the same time, we are working with countries to build their capacity so that the countries can access money directly from the donor countries or from the Green Climate Fund or the adaptation, other financial mechanisms. Because they have all of these fiduciary requirements that you have. You have to have all of these policies that respond to a whole number of things. And while you're talking about putting these things in place, and while it takes you 3 to 4 years to get some money, you know how many climate-related disasters you will have in 4 years while you're just trying to get access to 1 million or 3 million or 5 million. So sometimes it's very upsetting because they make it very difficult for small countries like those of us in CARICOM to access this money. And it takes so long to get the money that the circumstances under which you're trying to fix when you started the process of getting the money had changed by the time you're getting the money. So our political leaders have been saying over and over again, look, you need to simplify the way that we can get money because this is not a favor that you're doing to us. This is an obligation that you agreed to as part of the Paris Agreement, and you are causing the problem. You see? And the other side of this that is very also upsetting is that not only are we suffering the impacts of the effects of climate change, but in many cases, in fact in all the cases, our countries have to incur debt to be able to respond to some of the climate-related disasters. When a road is washed away, a bridge is washed out, some countries actually have to borrow loans to fix that back up. And so we already have high debt levels, which means that you're getting further in the red while you're still talking about all of the processes we have to follow to go and get a little bit of money.
Yeah, and that was actually going to be, part of my next question, because I was going to say more, how is it then, or to what extent does the center sort of deal with a lot of those immediate concerns or address some of the immediate impacts, given these difficulties, in accessing funding and sort of the international, just the circumstances that we're working with now. What are some of the ways that we can, that we work to sort of address those that the impacts as we face them?
We try to work, for example, the center is accredited to the Green Climate Fund, which is one of the financial mechanisms under the Climate Change Convention. And we try to do what we call a programmatic approach. We work with multiple countries who want to pursue similar actions and then try to access monies to work in multiple countries at the same time. We also work with the member states to access funding to improve the capacity of the focal points in the governments across the region, so that they are aware of all of the processes that are required to access money. And then on the big side, sort of one of the big side of the center, as I said, is that we work on trying to ensure that we have the climate data, which then provides the rationale as to why we need certain amounts of money, and if we get the money, what is the expected impact of that investment going to be on people's lives and livelihoods. So because when you go to the donors and they say, look, I want $20 million to do drainage improvement in South Ignacio town so that when you have a lot of rain, it doesn't flood out the towns. They want to know, well, okay, so what is going to be the impact on the people? Have you done the feasibility studies that will show that so while the feasibility study might take a year or two, but the people in San Ignacio and the people in other parts of Belize know that when there's a lot of rain, we always get flood.
Yeah.
So that data.
Look at the floods of last year.
Correct.
Yeah.
And then you're saying, but you just can't go and show them pictures and say, see, this is what.
This has never happened before.
Right? You have to go and there's a whole process of finding out, well, how often is this likely to happen?
Yeah.
You know, what is the impact of it? And then you say you want to do A, B, and C. And if you do that, how is that going to reduce it?
Yeah.
And what is the climate adaptation incremental cost? Because they're saying, oh, some of that stuff is just normal development. We don't fund that. We only fund the portion that would do the climate resilient piece, right? Again,
And-
upsetting.
Yeah, of course, of course. Even hearing you explain it, and I think one of the things too is also acknowledging that there will be an impact, even if these targets are hit. The goal is to minimize the change within our climates, but we are seeing and continue to see. And I think one of the examples that just always startles me is again the rising sea levels. What's the prediction with what we are facing today?
About 0.4 meters, and almost half a meter in sea level. Now that sounds.
And for a place like Belize City, that is.
Oh, that's going to cause not only Belize City, but if you look at San Pedro, Kikaka, they're literally at sea level. Portions of Belize City are below sea level. And so you could expect that a substantial part of the city would be underwater. Already we have what we call this nuisance flooding, right? Where when the tides are high, already you're starting
With a little bit of rain.
A little bit of rain.
Yeah.
Now, to put that number in perspective, a rule of thumb, right, is that every 1 inch of sea level rise will flood 100 inches of beach. So 1 foot of sea level rise will flood 100 feet of land. 1 meter, you know, that's 3 feet roughly, 300 feet. So we don't have to look far.
Yeah. Yeah.
In terms of Belize to see this. Go to Monkey River.
Yeah,
Right?
exactly, that's what I was
Monkey River has lost over almost about 1,200 feet of beach in the last 30 years or so. About 4 or 5 rows of houses have completely
Families have lost
disappeared.
homes, yeah.
The cemetery is now about to be lost. Because you go down there and you see some sandbags trying to keep the sea from washing the graves out. You go to Hopkins, you go to Placencia, Dangriga. You go to San Pedro, you go to Kikaka. You're starting to see, now what you're seeing now is nothing compared to what we will expect if we get to that 1.5 degree I've been talking about.
Yeah, and I guess that's a great point that you'll drive home. That it's not a matter of waiting for finances to mitigate. It's actually to stop what's taking place and to somehow salvage the situation. Let me ask you, do you feel that the Caribbean voice is given sufficient space in these negotiations as nations that are most vulnerable to impact?
The Caribbean, the quick answer to that is I'm not sure we are given this space, but we demand this space. And the region has been very successful in sort of navigating through the negotiations. So the Belize is part of CARICOM, and we negotiate in the climate change negotiations as part of the Alliance of Small Island States called AOSIS. And we have some, we are few in number, but we have some of the best negotiators that exist. And so, for example, it is because of that kind of work that we were successful in getting the 1.5 degree temperature goal into the Paris Agreement. So we have very experienced and dedicated and competent negotiators who then negotiate and tries to influence positions and that outcomes that come from these global meetings. Now, sometimes there are the kind of horse trading that happens, and that is when the region, also when we are united, we tend to get the best outcomes, meaning that if there is something that a particular country or group of countries want, and they want the support of the 15 CARICOM countries in terms of a vote. You know, then sometimes what happens is that there are these negotiations that then allows either a particular country to deliver more financing to a country or to try to influence some of their colleagues to take more bolder action. So there's some of that. Now, when the leaders go, as they will, for COP26 at the end of October, you know, that is, as I said, it's a diplomatic thing. The negotiators, they try to negotiate amongst themselves. You have some countries that are outright blocking. You know, they don't want to make any progress. And ultimately, when you can't go any further, you bring in the political leaders, and hopefully they can structure a deal.
My question is, and you know, not getting too technical here, but having recognized that there's a need for expedited action on all fronts, in cutting down emission and also in being able to support countries that are impacted. But to have this meeting in the middle of a pandemic, so many of these nations have an easy out to say, well, look, we are battling a health crisis. Do you foresee that to be? I mean, what's the plan? You can almost expect that you will hear that.
Marlene, that is a very difficult issue. How do we balance the climate change crisis with the COVID crisis and then trying to have this meeting in the middle of the pandemic? Generally, what has been the case, at least the signals that we're hearing, is that on a regular year outside of a pandemic, these negotiations are so difficult. And generally, we don't get the kind of outcomes we want. So if we're not there in person, it's going to be even worse, right? Because of the issues of access and bandwidth, the time zone difference, and how do you effectively participate. It's one thing to sit aside across the table from somebody and stare them in the eye and tell them what their lack of action is causing for you. And when you're on a Zoom call or some kind of platform where they don't even have their video on, they can be doing completely something else and you don't know. So there has been a general preference for an in-person meeting, simple because this particular COP is so important for global action that if we are not there, we worry about what is the outcome. But by going there, then we're also exposing ourselves to the pandemic and all of the complicated logistics that go with that. The UK already has quarantine requirements for people coming from countries that are red listed. You have to quarantine for 5 days if you are vaccinated and 10 days if you're unvaccinated. Luckily, they have promised to pick up the cost for the quarantine. But how you get from one country to the COP and back, all of that is an unknown. And as it is, while the region is preparing to have representation, we are still trying to ascertain what that representation will look like because of the costs and because of the worry about the pandemic. So we might have a scaled back representation this year, hopefully by October 15th, because of the centers working with the CARICOM Secretariat, we would have more of an understanding of who's going.
And as we close, because we are out of time as much as this is a pressing issue, what do you say to Belizeans about why they should tune in, why they should be up to date as to what's going to happen come the end of October into November?
Because Belizeans and all the people in the region need to be tuned in because climate change is impacting all of their lives. It's impacting some people's lives even more than it's impacting others. And so you have to be worried in terms of ensuring that our governments across the region are also doing all they can to ensure that with the little resources they have, that they're putting it in those areas that is going to impact positively the resilience of the people. Meaning, you know, if you're going to be building a road or a school or whatever it is, have you factored in the climate risk? Right? Have you factored in the climate risk? And if so, then make sure that it's built so it can withstand some of the increases that is expected to happen. Farmers, obviously, fisher folks, and so on, who are at the foot, tourism. These are sectors that climate change has an absolutely significant impact on year after year. You need to be tuned in so that you can see what is it that you can do and how we can all work collectively to ensure that there are the national level policies and laws and regulations that are being done to help to protect the environment. For example, a simple one, in terms of protecting and conserving mangroves, right? And how important that is to buffer against coastal erosion and things like that, and hurricanes and so on.
All right. Well, we look forward to hearing this same kind of passion as well, because there is a reality that must be told to the rest of the world, and definitely we'll be tuning in to find out more. Thank you for coming in and having this discussion.
Thank you both. Thank you.
We're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we're going to be talking about a mandatory training on child abuse. We'll tell you the details in a few. Stay tuned.